Hand over the barn keys and we will not have a problem. That was the first thing he said to me. Not a question, not a request, an order. His hand rested on his duty belt like he was ready for resistance. His wife Mugrat stood behind him on my property line, arms crossed, smiling like she had just won a game nobody else knew they were playing. I looked at the badge on his chest, then back at her. "You really sent your husband for this," I said. She did not blink. "You have ignored 4 violations," she said. "The livestock and nursery endanger this community." He stepped closer, trying to tower over me. I kept my tone flat, my eyes steady. "This is private property," I said, "not according to her." Mugrat moved forward, voice sharp as broken glass. "Do not play games with us. You either cooperate or we escalate this to county-level enforcement." I could feel the arrogance radiating off both of them. One flexing borrowed authority, the other feeding on it like oxygen. But underneath my silence, something stirred. Because while she thought this was about barn keys and cow pastures, it was not. It was about power, control, and the belief that badges make bullies untouchable. And she had just walked straight into my investigation without even knowing it. So when Officer Dennis Whitmore said again, "Keys now," I stepped forward, looked him dead in the eyes, and said calm as morning frost, "You might want to check whose jurisdiction you are standing in, deputy." They did not know it yet, but I was the county sheriff, and I had been watching them for months. When the patrol car finally rolled back down my gravel driveway, I stood there staring at the dust settling behind it. My hands were steady, but my blood was not. It is not every day your neighbor sends her uniformed husband to intimidate you over cattle and sunflowers. The truth is, this was never about compliance or community safety. It never is with people like her. It is about dominance, about making sure everyone knows who controls this neighborhood. My name is Nathan Cross. I moved back to Ridgewood County last spring after my mother passed. The homestead had been in our family since the 1950s, built by my grandfather with his own 2 hands. Stone fences, cedar barn, greenhouse nursery, and a small dairy operation that used to supply half the town. I came back to restore it, not to fight over it. The homeowners association showed up 6 weeks later. New board, new rules, same arrogance. And leading it like a general in pearls was Margaret Whitmore, retired insurance agent, self-appointed queen of property values. She spoke like every sentence should be carved in marble, always smiling, always watching, always calculating. The first notice came 2 days after our welcome meeting. Unapproved agricultural structure detected. Livestock requires inspection. My grandfather's barn, the one she called a biohazard. I ignored it. Then came the fines, then the letters, then tonight. Before we go any further, if you believe people like Margaret should not exist or need to be held accountable, subscribe to my channel, because we share daily stories like this that change perspectives and deliver the justice you are looking for. She thought she would scare me by sending her badge-wearing husband. She had no idea that intimidation is just another form of confession, and I have spent my entire career reading between the lines. What she does not know yet is that this fight is not staying on her terms. It is about to move onto mine. I grew up on this property long before there were fences, forms, or association bylaws. Back then it was just me, my mother, my grandfather, and 100 acres of wild land that smelled like hay and honeysuckle. The barn was not built by contractors. It was raised by hand. Grandpa mixed mortar in a wheelbarrow, laid stone by stone, and told me once, "Never let anyone claim what your blood has built." I did not understand it then. Now it is the line I live by. Every summer had the same rhythm, the call of roosters at dawn, the thump of hooves on packed earth, the hiss of water filling the nursery troughs. Grandpa did not believe in shortcuts. If you build it right, he would say, you only have to build it once. He treated this farm like proof that work and freedom were the same thing. When my mother died, I promised I would keep both alive. So when I moved back, I patched the barn roof, rebuilt the greenhouse, brought in 12 head of cattle, and planted the nursery my grandmother had always dreamed of. For a few months, it felt like the past was still breathing. Then Margaret showed up. It started with a friendly knock. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she said, voice bright, eyes scanning my property like an appraiser. She wore a blazer in July and handed me a glossy pamphlet titled Community Standards and Agricultural Compliance. I skimmed it and smiled politely. She smiled wider, like she had just handed me a leash. A week later, she cornered me at the association meeting. The room smelled like stale coffee and ambition. She flipped through her binder and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Mr. Cross, you have an unregistered livestock operation on your property." Laughter from the back row. "It is a family farm," I said. "Unregistered," she repeated, savoring the word. "It has been here since before this subdivision existed," I replied. "Then it is definitely non-compliant," she said with a grin. That is when I realized Margaret did not care about safety or regulations. She cared about power, and she was not doing it alone. Her husband, Officer Dennis Whitmore, was never far behind. You would see his cruiser on random nights parked just close enough to my front gate for the headlights to hit my mailbox. No ticket, no reason, just presence. The kind that says we are watching. The first night it happened, I stood on the porch with a glass of water and watched the clock tick past midnight. The car did not move. Neither did I. He wanted me to feel cornered. I wanted him to know I do not scare. After that, I started keeping records. Dates, photos, copies of every letter. My grandfather taught me farming. The academy taught me documentation. You learn fast that truth only matters when it is written down. The next few weeks felt like a slow invasion. Every time I stepped outside, there was something new. A bright yellow notice tacked to the barn door, a drone hovering overhead, a neighbor pretending to walk their dog while taking pictures of my cows. Margaret called it community vigilance. I called it harassment. One morning I caught her standing near the fence line holding a clipboard like a weapon. She did not even flinch when I said, "You know that is trespassing, right?" She smiled sweetly. "Just verifying compliance," she said. "We cannot have unauthorized farms contaminating the water table." I almost laughed. The farm had its own well, a natural aquifer my grandfather had tapped 50 years ago. No shared line, no community meter, just groundwater and gravity. That is when I started digging into the bylaws. Page after page of association jargon, fence heights, lawn specifications, structure approvals, but not a single clause giving them control over natural water sources or pre-existing agricultural operations. Then I pulled the county plat maps and old deed records. The aquifer was not even within the association boundary. An association cannot claim jurisdiction over private wells or grandfathered farms outside a recorded easement, but that never stops people like Margaret from trying. The following weekend, she escalated. A letter arrived marked urgent. Inside was an invoice. $3,000 for illegal agricultural runoff impacting community property. No hearing, no evidence, just debt by declaration. I walked to her house that afternoon. She was trimming hedges in her front yard, visor tilted, smile fixed. "Is this a joke?" I asked, waving the paper. "Rules are rules," she said. "You will find the payment details on the back." "I do not owe you a dime," I replied. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You think you are different because that barn was your grandfather's. Around here we do things by the book." "Whose book?" I asked. "Mine," she answered without hesitation. I remember the sound of her shears snapping closed, sharp, final, like a threat. That night I sat on the porch staring out at the pasture, flipping through folders of property records, county permits, and photos of my grandfather's old blueprints. The air smelled like fresh hay and damp soil, exactly how it did when he used to sit out here after a long day's work. I could almost hear him saying, "Do not let anyone claim what your blood has built." For the first time, I understood what he meant. It was not about fences or water. It was about standing your ground when someone tries to rewrite your history. Margaret thought she had won. She thought a fine and a threat would make me bow. But intimidation is just another kind of invitation, and she had just invited me to fight back. So I gathered every document, every photo, every letter she had ever sent. I built a case file the way my grandfather built that barn, one layer at a time, solid and permanent. Then I wrote her a reply, one line printed in bold across the top. "You want paperwork, you will get paperwork." I sealed it, dropped it in her mailbox, and walked home under the same moonlight reflecting off her husband's cruiser parked at the corner. The difference was this time I was not angry. I was focused. Because the next round would not be about neighborhood rules. It would be about law, and I enforce it for a living. It started small like most invasions do. One morning I noticed tire tracks cutting through my pasture, fresh ones. I followed them to the edge of the property where the cattle fence had been cut. Not broken, cut. Clean lines, deliberate sabotage. 2 cows had wandered into the road overnight. A neighbor found them grazing near the highway. When I reported the damage, the association responded with a fine for livestock at large. I called the police to file a criminal complaint. Guess who showed up? Officer Dennis Whitmore. He took one look at the fence and said, "Looks like wear and tear to me." I pointed at the clean edges. "That is a wire cutter, Dennis," he shrugged. "You should maintain your fencing better. We cannot have animals running wild, endangering the public." I did not argue. I just watched him write his report, knowing full well it would disappear into the filing cabinet of ignored complaints. That night, I installed cameras. Motion sensors along the fence line, one inside the barn, one angled toward the driveway gate. Nothing fancy, just clear enough to catch faces. I was not looking for drama. I was building a record. Then something strange happened. The visits stopped. No letters, no drones, no surveillance, just quiet. That kind of silence is not peace. It is planning. The next association meeting was packed. Margaret stood at the front like a politician, flipping through her binder. "We have received multiple reports of noncompliance," she said, staring right at me. "It is important to remember that community officers can enforce agricultural standards at any time." That word "officers" hung heavy in the air. I saw Dennis in the back, arms folded, still in uniform. Even though the badge meant nothing in that room, it was a show of force. Everyone saw it. Most stayed silent. A few shifted in their seats. When the meeting ended, I walked past her and said quietly, "You are not as clever as you think." She smiled that same insurance commercial smile and said, "You should really consider selling. These things have a way of getting exhausting." I walked out before I said something I could not take back. On the way home, I thought about my grandfather and that old line, "Never let anyone claim what your blood has built." That is when I knew I was not leaving. They wanted a fight. Fine. But I would not be swinging in the dark anymore. The days after that meeting felt heavier. It was not just the heat or the tension. It was the sense that I was being watched even when I was not. The mail started coming half opened. Feed containers were overturned in the night. Once I found a bright orange violation notice taped to my nursery greenhouse that said "Unauthorized Commercial Agriculture." It was my personal garden. My grandmother's sunflowers were growing in the same soil she had planted 40 years ago. I stopped reacting. That is what she wanted, for me to explode, to lose credibility. Instead, I kept documenting. Every notice went into a folder. Every incident had a timestamp. I even logged the drone flights over my property. The pattern was clear. Anything I fixed or improved, they found a new way to weaponize. Margaret called it compliance management. I called it targeted harassment. But the worst part was not what she did. It was how everyone else acted like it was normal. You could see the fear in the neighbor's eyes. Nobody wanted to cross her. She would fine one person for weeds and let another slide for months just to prove who she favored. The association had turned into her personal kingdom, and her husband was the sword. One night around midnight, I saw the cruiser again, parked in the same spot near my driveway, headlights dimmed, engine running low. I walked out with my phone recording and stood at the gate. He did not move, did not roll down the window, just sat there 10 minutes, 15. Then he pulled away slow, tires crunching gravel like a warning. I went back inside and reviewed the camera footage. He was not patrolling the street. He was sitting there facing the barn, watching it, watching me. That was the first time I felt the anger settle into something colder. Not rage, resolve. If this was the game they wanted, I would play it their way. By the rules, documented and precise. I started keeping a log book like a criminal case file, every page labeled with dates, times, names, and short notes. I even started pulling public patrol records and comparing the nights he parked outside with his official shift schedule. Half of them did not match. That is when I realized something important. He was not on duty during most of these visits. He was using his uniform to intimidate me off my own property. That is not just unethical. It is abuse of authority. I sat there staring at the records, feeling the weight of it all. A normal person would have packed up and left by now. I almost did. I even looked at listings one night, thought about how easy it would be to just walk away. But then I stepped outside, looked at that barn glowing faintly under the porch light, and remembered my grandfather's voice saying, "You only lose what you hand over." That line pulled me back. I was not built to run. I was built to finish what I start. And if Margaret wanted to turn this into a battle of paperwork, I would make sure every page had her name on it. The final push came the way all her moves did, through paperwork wrapped in arrogance. A white envelope taped to my front door, stamped Urgent Association Legal Action. Inside was a cease and desist order. According to Margaret, I was to immediately stop unauthorized use of community agricultural resources and dismantle all unapproved livestock structures. She even attached photos of my own barn and nursery as evidence. I sat at the kitchen table reading it 3 times just to make sure I was not hallucinating. She was claiming my private farm as a community hazard. The signature at the bottom was not hers this time. It was her husband's, Officer Dennis Whitmore, acting as community enforcement liaison. That is not a real title. It is intimidation dressed in letterhead. I laughed, but it was not a happy sound. It was the kind of laugh that comes when disbelief meets fury. I looked at the barn through the window, the same one my grandfather had built with his bare hands, the one that had stood before the association even existed, and something inside me hardened. I called the association office. Of course, no answer. I called the county clerk. They told me the association had filed no official complaints, just internal administrative action. Translation, fake legal threat. That is when I realized she was not just overstepping, she was bluffing. But it was a dangerous bluff backed by a badge. That night I opened every file I had. Drone footage, letters, meeting notes, photos of her husband's cruiser, timestamps from the cameras. I organized everything into folders, digital and paper. Evidence, pattern, motive. The case was writing itself. The next day she showed up unannounced. Golf cart in the driveway, engine still running. "I hope you read the notice," she said, arms crossed like she was auditioning for authority. "Failure to comply will result in immediate escalation." I said, "Margaret, you have escalated enough." She tilted her head. "Then we understand each other." I nodded once. "Perfectly." She drove off smug and satisfied, believing she had won. But she had just crossed the one line you never cross with me. She made it personal. I spent the rest of the day in silence sorting documents into one neat pile labeled Association Fraud Evidence. Underneath that, I slipped the letter she left me sealed in a plastic sleeve. When you work in my line of work, you learn that the smallest detail is the one that breaks a case wide open. By sunset, the barn lights flickered on their timer, casting long shadows across the pasture. I thought of my grandfather and how he used to sit here with his old coffee thermos and say, "Some people build, others control. Builders always win in the long run." I closed the folder, took a slow breath, and said quietly to myself, "You wanted paperwork, Margaret. You are about to get the federal kind." The morning after her cease and desist, I drove to the county record's office. No coffee, no distraction, just determination and a flash drive in my pocket. I had spent weeks reacting to her nonsense. It was time to go on offense. The clerk looked surprised when I asked for historic plat and environmental filings for our subdivision. Most people come in asking about fence permits or property lines. I asked about water rights and agricultural easements. She handed me a heavy binder that smelled like dust and neglect. I flipped through pages of faded maps until I saw it. Our property line inked in thick black stretching past the association boundary. Then near the bottom, a tiny label, Federal Agricultural Preservation Zone, Cross-Family Homestead, my grandfather's name, my land. And according to that notation, the aquifer feeding the farm was under a federal environmental easement established decades ago. That meant no private entity, no association, no local board had any authority over it. Their control ended at the fence line. Everything beyond was federal jurisdiction. I scanned every page, saved every map, and took photos of the original stamp. United States Department of Agriculture, 1962. My grandfather must have filed for the protection himself. I sat there staring at that date, thinking about all the times he told me, "I built this place to last longer than the people who think they run it." He was right. By the time I left the building, I had more than proof. I had leverage. I called an old contact from my law enforcement days, a quiet man named Harris, now working federal agricultural crimes. I kept it light, told him I had a possible case of private entity interference in a federally protected agricultural zone. He did not ask for details, just said, "Send what you have." That night I put together a folder labeled Preliminary Evidence, Association Interference. Maps, letters, drone photos, Margaret's fake legal notices. I added one more file, financial records from the association website, including every signature from her husband. A day later, Harris called back. "This looks dirty," he said. "We will do a surface check. No promises." I told him that was all I needed. Sometimes all you need is a whisper of authority to make corruption panic. Over the next few days, I started building quiet alliances. The association treasurer, Carol, had been looking worn down for months. You could tell she did not like Margaret's power games. I caught her outside one evening and asked, "Ever wonder where all the maintenance money goes?" She laughed bitterly and said, "Every single day." We met in my barn after dark, lights off except for one work lamp. She slid a stack of invoices across the workbench. Agricultural assessment contracts signed by companies that did not exist anymore. Fake businesses, fake inspections, real money. "That is embezzlement," I said. "That is Tuesday around here," she replied. I smiled. For the first time in months, it felt like I was not alone. Carol was not the only one who had had enough. My next ally came from 3 properties over. A quiet man named George Patterson, retired county assessor, 74 years old, sharp as a blade. He had spent half his life reviewing property values and land use permits. When I showed him the maps I found, his eyebrows lifted. "They have been claiming jurisdiction over federal land?" he asked. I nodded. "And trying to fine me for it." He whistled under his breath. "That is not just illegal, that is monumentally stupid." George helped me cross-check everything. He pointed out where Margaret's community boundary map had been altered, extending association control 75 feet beyond the legal limit. She had literally redrawn property lines and filed them in neighborhood packets to make people think she had authority. George chuckled darkly. "This is what happens when power gets bored." We spent the evening going through every association document we could access. The pattern was clear. Fake inspection fees, inflated landscaping costs, and service providers that did not exist. At least 4 checks every month were signed by Officer Dennis Whitmore, Margaret's name on the approval line. Husband and wife laundering association money through ghost companies. I added every piece to my growing evidence wall. The files filled 3 folders, each thicker than the one before. I labeled the latest one financial manipulation, active case. Old habits die hard. By then, the tension in the neighborhood had shifted. People started noticing how quiet I had become. Margaret noticed too. I stopped arguing, stopped reacting. That scared her more than confrontation ever did. A week later, flyers appeared on mailboxes with my address printed in bold. Non-compliant resident, community health hazard. Underneath was a photo of my barn and cattle. No context, no evidence, just fear bait. I tore one down, crumpled it, and laughed out loud. She was slipping. The more pressure she felt, the sloppier she got. The next morning, Dennis came by again, but this time he was not in uniform. Civilian clothes, hands in pockets, pretending to be casual. He said, "You should really back off these accusations. They make you look paranoid." I said, "I am not accusing anyone. I am documenting." He stared at me for a moment, then smirked and said, "Keep filming. Maybe you will get famous." He turned to leave, but I caught something I had not noticed before. A gold association ring on his finger engraved with the initials GF, not association issued, custom. I checked the next day and learned those initials matched one of the fake maintenance companies, Green Fields Agricultural Services. He was not just helping her sign checks. He was part of the shell business. I forwarded everything to Harris. The contracts, the signatures, the ring photo, the flyers. His response was short but telling. "Stay quiet. You are sitting on felony-level fraud." For the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. The kind that comes when you know the truth is finally leaning your way. But peace never lasts long in a war of power. Margaret could sense something was changing, and she was about to remind me how dangerous desperate people can be. It started with a knock that did not sound like a neighbor's. 3 short bangs, firm, impatient. When I opened the door, no one was there. Just a rolled-up notice shoved under the mat. This one was worse than the last. It said association violation, dangerous property owner in bold red ink. My picture again, my address again, signed Community Watch. Margaret had weaponized shame. She wanted the neighborhood to see me as a threat, to isolate me, to turn me into an outcast before the truth could surface. I could almost admire the strategy if it were not so desperate. Later that night, I heard voices near the gate. A couple from 2 streets over whispering to each other, "That is him, the one with the illegal farm." I stepped outside and they scattered like startled birds. I was not angry anymore, just tired of cowards hiding behind rumors. Then came the threats. Handwritten notes slipped into my mailbox with no return address. "Leave while you still can. Sell before the fines triple. You are not wanted here." All printed on the same association stationery Margaret used for official letters. She did not even bother to hide it. That is the problem with people who think they are untouchable. They get lazy. I took photos of every note, sealed them in plastic, labeled them by date. My evidence binder was starting to look more like a prosecution file than a folder. 2 days later, I got an email from Harris. Short, precise. "We found significant inconsistencies in their filings. Keep collecting." That was enough to keep me moving. I decided to dig deeper into their so-called agricultural liability insurance. It was mentioned in every budget report as one of the biggest annual expenses. I searched state databases for the company name. Prairie Shield Agricultural Coverage. Nothing. Then I looked it up in corporate records. Dissolved. Closed 7 years ago. Their entire insurance coverage was fake. Every homeowner had been paying for protection that did not exist. Margaret was charging everyone, pocketing the money and covering it with ghost paperwork. I sent the documentation to both Harris and Carol. She replied almost instantly. "Oh my God, this explains everything. She has been paying herself." That same night, Margaret drove by slowly in her golf cart, eyes locked on my property. I stood on the porch and waved. She did not wave back. For the first time, I saw something behind that smug expression. Fear. When power starts to slip, it does not go quietly. It claws, it bites, it spreads lies to stay alive. And that is exactly what she did. She went door to door spinning stories about me being under investigation, trying to make the neighborhood turn against me before I could expose her. But what she did not know was that her real investigation had already begun, and she was at the center of it. The more desperate Margaret became, the louder her lies got. By the end of that week, she had posted a statement on the association website accusing me of contaminating community groundwater with agricultural runoff. She claimed I had damaged the neighborhood drainage system and stolen water equipment. Funny thing was, she attached photos of my own barn as evidence. It would have been laughable if it was not so calculated, but she was not fooling everyone anymore. Neighbors who once ignored me started stopping by quietly. Short conversations at the mailbox, quick glances over the shoulder. One woman whispered, "I know what she is doing. I have seen the records." Another man left a folded note in my door that simply said, "Stay strong, she is cracking." That is how tyrants fall. Not with a bang, but with a slow, quiet loss of loyalty. Meanwhile, I kept tightening the net. Every night I organized files, matched signatures, highlighted inconsistencies. My evidence folder had grown into a full binder labeled Association Corruption, Active Case. Inside were invoices from dissolved companies, falsified inspection reports, fake insurance filings, and her husband's signatures on every check. I also documented every personal contact, every time he used his badge to enforce her rules. That is where federal law comes into play, the statute that forbids public servants from using their position for private gain. And Officer Dumps Whatma had been doing exactly that, threatening residents and signing checks for a private association under his own authority. Harassed confirmed it. He said, "If this checks out, we are looking at serious criminal charges." I asked what happens next. He paused for a moment and said, "Keep doing what you are doing. Make her comfortable. People like her always hang themselves when they think no one is watching." And so I stayed quiet. I stopped reacting, stopped posting, stopped attending meetings. Silence makes predators nervous. Margaret started sending more notices, petty ones, desperate ones. My grass was too long. My lights were too bright. She even filed a noise complaint claiming my cattle were disturbing the peace at midnight. They were asleep. It did not matter. Every letter had her husband's initials. Every signature was one more nail in her own coffin. One evening, I found her husband parked near the corner again, pretending to check his phone. I walked out to the end of the driveway, calm as ever. He looked up expecting anger. Instead, I said, "Evening, officer. Nice night for community service." He stared at me, unsure if I meant it as a joke. I smiled and added, you might want to tell your wife to start filing real insurance paperwork. The color drained from his face. He drove off without a word. That night I closed my binder, turned off the light, and looked out at the barn. The structure was perfectly still, glowing faintly from the porch lamp above it. For the first time, the farm did not feel like a target. It felt like a fortress. They had wanted to drown me in paperwork. Instead, I built a case that could bury them. The email came on a Thursday morning. Subject line, Emergency Community Enforcement Meeting, Attendance Mandatory. That was Mugrat's way of saying we are about to make a scene. The notice claimed there had been continued non-compliance by a homeowner endangering neighborhood safety. She did not name me, but she did not have to. Everyone knew. The meeting was set for Saturday, 7 in the evening at the community center. I already knew what was coming. This was her last play. The public humiliation, the staged confrontation, the grand performance of power. But this time, she was not the only one with a plan. Harassa's voice replayed in my head from the night before. We have enough evidence to move. We just need her to make it official. I had agreed to cooperate with federal monitoring. Nothing cinematic, just documented communication synced to an investigative team staged half a block away. Stay calm, do not provoke, he had said. She will dig her own grave. Saturday came heavy with humidity. The community center lights glared through the windows as I walked up the path. I could see silhouettes inside, neighbors seated, Mugrat standing at the front, her husband beside her like a bodyguard. His uniform was not regulation. No official badge tonight, but the stance was there. Always the symbol, never the substance. As soon as I walked in, the room went quiet. Mugrat smiled, that politician's smile. Mr. Cross, she said sweetly, thank you for joining us. We have had quite a few complaints about your property. I am sure we can resolve this civilly. I said nothing, just took a seat near the front, close enough to hear every word clearly. She launched into her speech, packing in front of a display on the wall, photos of my barn, my nursery, even my backyard security cameras. This is what happens when one person refuses to respect community standards, she said. Murmur rippled through the room. Her husband stepped forward, pulling an envelope from his jacket. As acting enforcement liaison, he said, I am here to collect the community's property, specifically the barn keys and livestock registration. The air in the room shifted. My heart slowed instead of racing. I could feel every eye on me, waiting to see what I would do. Mugrat folded her arms, chin raised in triumph. I stood calm, deliberate. You really want to make this official, I said. Mugrat blinked. Excuse me, I stepped closer. Let us make it official. Outside, I heard it before anyone saw it. The low rumble of engines turning the corner, the synchronized crunch of tires on gravel. I knew that sound. Federal vehicles, timing perfect. The first black SUV rolled to a stop in front of the community center. Lights flashing soft blew through the glass. Then another, then a third. The room froze. Mugrat laughed nervously. What is going on? I turned toward her and said quietly, you are about to find out. At first, nobody moved. You could hear the hum of the ceiling fan and the faint whine of those federal engines idling outside. Mugrat turned to her husband, her face stiff. Go check, she whispered. He hesitated, then squared his shoulders and stepped toward the door. The moment he opened it, blue light flooded the room. Voices followed. Federal agents stepped back from the entrance. The command was not loud, but it was final. You can always tell when real authority walks in, the kind that does not need to raise its voice. 2 agents entered, badges out, calm, composed. Behind them came Harass. He looked exactly how I remembered him. Gray suit, patient eyes, the kind of presence that fills a room without trying. He gave me the smallest nod before turning to Mugrat. Mrs. Watma, he said evenly, we have a federal warrant to seize association financial and operational records related to property fund misuse and jurisdictional fraud. Please step aside. Mugrat blinked fast, trying to catch up. This is absurd, she said. We are a homeowners association. Harass interrupted her. Ma'am, you are under investigation for misappropriation of funds, wire fraud, and interference with federally protected agricultural land. You will have a chance to explain everything, but right now you need to sit down. The room broke into murmur. Her husband moved instinctively, hand near his belt. Instantly, 2 agents closed the gap between them. Officer Watma, one of them said, please remove your hand from your belt. His tone did not waver. You are not acting in any official capacity here. Mugrat turned pale. "You cannot talk to him like that," she said. "He is a police officer." The agent replied flatly. "Not tonight, ma'am." Dumps hesitated, then lifted his hands. They guided him to a chair near the wall. The uniform did not help him anymore. The badge that had once scared the neighborhood now hung useless at his side. I stayed quiet, leaning against the back wall as the agents began unpacking folders, computers, and sealed envelopes. One team started photographing documents on the association table. Another escorted the treasurer Carol outside to give a statement. For once, she looked free. Mugrat kept talking, voice shaking between outrage and panic. "This is a setup," she shouted. She pointed at me. "He is behind this. He has been harassing us for months." Harassed did not even glance up. "Ma'am, we have your signatures on 14 falsified invoices, 4 shell companies under your address, and 1 expired insurance policy listed as active coverage. I think you have incriminated yourself enough." The neighbors watched, stunned. Some whispered, some filmed. One old man in the back muttered, "About time." Mugrat tried again, this time pleading. "You do not understand. I was protecting the community." Harassed cut her off gently but firmly, by stealing from it. She froze, eyes darting between me and her husband. He would not look at her. His silence said everything. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I just stood there still and steady, letting the truth do the work. It was better than any revenge I could have planned. When the agents finally began reading them their rights, Mugrat's voice cracked. "You cannot do this to me." One of the agents replied, calm as stone. "Ma'am, we already did." The air in the room shifted. Years of her fake power evaporated in seconds. And for the first time since this all began, I felt something I had not felt in months. Quiet justice. Mugrat's voice broke completely when the agent started collecting her files. "You are making a mistake," she shouted, stepping toward the table. One of the agents moved between us, hand up calmly. "Ma'am, step back." She froze, trembling, her polished confidence unraveling right there under the fluorescent lights. The neighbors watched wide-eyed, phones out, half in disbelief, half in satisfaction. I did not say a word. There was nothing left to say. She had built this stage herself. Every accusation, every humiliation, every rule she used to cage others. Now she was center stage, trapped in her own performance. Harris turned to me once the noise settled. "Mr. Cross," he said evenly, "thank you for your cooperation. We will need formal statements, but you can head home once we are finished here." His tone was procedural, but his eyes told me everything. "It is over." I nodded once. Dennis stared at the floor, still in disbelief. You could see the moment it hit him. The realization that the badge he used as a weapon had become evidence. Federal law was not just words in a book anymore. It was his reality. Using public authority for private benefit did not just cost him his position. It cost him his entire career. Margaret tried one last time to spin control. "This is harassment," she said, voice cracking. "He set me up. He is the reason all of this happened." She jabbed a shaking finger in my direction. "He is not even supposed to be here. He is." Harris raised an eyebrow. "He is what, ma'am?" She stopped. I saw the exact moment it clicked. She had finally put it together. The calm, the precision, the timing. Her face went pale. "You are not just a farmer," she whispered. I met her eyes for the first time that night. "No," I said softly. "I am the county sheriff. And I am the reason they are here." Her knees gave out just enough for her to grab the back of a chair. The room went silent, except for the faint hum of recording equipment and the steady clicking of cameras documenting every inch of her downfall. Someone whispered from the back, "Guess she picked the wrong guy this time." A ripple of nervous laughter followed. Even Harris cracked a small smile before turning to finish the paperwork. They led Dennis out first, hands behind his back, professional courtesy, but the message was clear. Margaret followed soon after, still talking, still trying to explain how this was all a misunderstanding, how she was only protecting community property. Her voice faded as they walked her outside, replaced by the low murmur of relief from the crowd. I stepped to the window and watched the reflection of red and blue lights flash across the barn in the distance. The same barn she had tried to take from me, the same one my grandfather had built by hand. The symbolism was not lost on me. Power changes hands quietly, but justice always makes some noise. Harris came over, his tone softer now. "We will file the reports. You will get a copy for your records. You did good." I said I did not do it for recognition. I did it for peace. He nodded. "That is the best kind." The community center emptied slowly after the agents left. People whispered as they passed me, half afraid to speak too loud, half needing to say something. One man I had never even met stopped at the door and said, "Thank you for standing up to them." Another just nodded and walked out, relief in his eyes. It was strange how fast fear turned into gratitude once the lights changed color. When the last car pulled away, I stepped outside. The night air felt heavier, quieter, like the whole neighborhood was holding its breath. The blue strobes from the federal SUVs still flashed against the wet pavement, reflecting off the pasture like scattered stars. Somewhere near the community center, the sprinklers kicked on, misting over the trimmed lawns that used to be battlegrounds of petty control. For the first time in months, it sounded peaceful. I walked toward the barn and stopped at the entrance. The structure stood solid against the night sky, glowing faintly from the lights inside. I could see my reflection next to the badge they had left behind as evidence. Dennis's badge, the same one he had used to intimidate people, to enforce fake rules, to scare me into silence. Now it sat inside a clear evidence bag on the table. I stared at it for a long time. It did not look powerful anymore. It looked pathetic. Behind me, the community center door closed with a dull thud. Harris was the last to leave. "We will handle everything from here," he said quietly. "You can finally rest." I nodded, but rest felt foreign. When you have been under attack long enough, peace feels suspicious. Still, I wanted to believe it. As his car pulled away, I sat down on the barn steps, letting my hand brush against the weathered wood, and I let the quiet settle over me. My grandfather used to say this land carries memory, that it remembers the hands that built it. I hoped he was right, because tonight this farm had witnessed everything. Her lies, his abuse of authority, my fight to hold on to what was ours. I thought about all the neighbors who had watched this unfold, the ones who had stayed silent, the ones who had finally spoken up. Maybe this place could heal now. Maybe freedom does not come from leaving. It comes from staying when staying costs you something. Out across the road, a window light flicked on. I could see silhouettes moving inside. Families who had once been too scared to speak, now talking again, their laughter faint but real. That sound hit harder than any victory speech ever could. The sprinklers slowed to a stop. The last blue flash from the departing convoy faded against the trees. The night returned to stillness. All that was left was the sound of crickets and the soft lowing of cattle settling in for the night, a rhythm that felt like breathing again. I stood up, took one last look around, and whispered to the quiet air, "You see that, Grandpa? They tried to steal your land. Instead, they buried themselves in it." The wind moved across the pasture, scattering the reflection of the porch lights into ripples of shadow. I smiled, not because I had won, but because I had finally stopped losing. The power she once used to control others was now evidence locked in federal custody. And as I walked back toward the house, the moonlight caught the edges of the barn, the same barn she had called community property. Now it was proof that justice still had a home here. It took 4 weeks for the dust to settle. Margaret was charged with wire fraud, misappropriation of community funds, and falsifying official documents. Her husband was terminated from the department pending federal review of his conduct. They tried to downplay it in the local news, but word travels fast in small towns. Every neighbor knew what happened. Every front yard that once displayed association proud member signs now sat bare. Like everyone was suddenly allergic to organized authority. I did not gloat. I did not celebrate. Justice does not feel like fireworks. It feels like quiet air after a long storm. The association board resigned within days of the raid. At the final emergency meeting, the residents voted unanimously to dissolve the organization altogether. No more community enforcement, no more agricultural compliance. And the first clause to be struck from the bylaws was the one Margaret herself had written: all agricultural operations subject to community oversight. That one hit differently. A few of the neighbors stopped by in the following weeks. They never stayed long, just enough to say thank you. One older woman from the corner lot shook my hand and said, "You are the man who ended the association." I told her I was not trying to end anything. I was just trying to live in peace. But the truth is, some fights end more than they start. The county restored my property rights in full. The fines vanished. The cease and desist letters became evidence tags in a federal case. My farm was no longer a crime scene. It was just a farm again. I hired a small crew to repair the fence, replace the cut wires, reinforce the barn doors my grandfather once hung. Watching the cattle graze peacefully in the morning light was like watching time repair itself, slow and steady. Carol, the treasurer, came by one morning to drop off paperwork. She looked lighter. "Feels strange, does it not?" she said. "Peace and silence." I smiled. We could use both. Before she left, she handed me a manila folder. Inside was a motion signed by the neighborhood council. They wanted to dedicate a small plaque near the main road honoring my grandfather. Cross Family Homestead, established 1954, protected forever. I stood there holding that paper, staring at the ink. My grandfather would have laughed. He never cared for plaques or ceremonies. But I could almost hear him saying, "Long as it is still yours, son, that is all that matters." I built a small wooden marker by the fence that weekend. Nothing fancy, just carved letters sealed in clear varnish. Cross Family Homestead. Beneath it, I planted a row of sunflowers. That was my grandmother's favorite. She always said sunflowers do not chase the sun. They remember where it rises. Now, every morning when the light hits the pasture, it feels like the world is reminding me what freedom really looks like. Not loud, not showy, just steady and earned. Sometimes I catch neighbors walking by, slowing down to look through the fence at the nursery blooming bright with color. Nobody argues anymore. Nobody files complaints. The sound of children laughing near the pond replaced the endless clicking of Margaret's clipboard. It feels like the neighborhood finally remembered how to breathe. Sometimes I wonder what Margaret tells herself now. Maybe she still believes she was right, that she was protecting something. People like her always rewrite their own stories to stay the hero. But the truth is simpler. She tried to control what she did not understand. Freedom. And freedom does not take orders. After everything ended, I kept thinking about the moment she realized it was over. The flash of confusion, the sound of those federal boots hitting the floor. It was not just her downfall.